The room went dead silent when she corrected the resident's technique. Laura Bennett had been at St. Michael's Hospital in Savannah for 8 months, which meant she was still invisible. The cardiac unit's night rotation had become her domain, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical hymn, monitors beeping in syncopated rhythms that sounded like music from a previous life. She moved through the corridors with her brown hair pulled into a severe bun, regulation tight, her scrubs always perfectly pressed as if she'd starched them herself at 2 in the morning. Most of the staff didn't know her. That was fine. She'd learned that anonymity was better than attention. The antiseptic smell clung to everything here, mixed with the faint copper of old blood and the acrid tang of floor wax that someone had applied too generously at 5 a.m. Her forearms bore thin, pale scars that she kept covered with long sleeves even when the Savannah heat pushed 90 degrees. When she inserted 4's 18-gauge needles into basilic veins, sometimes antecubital when she had a difficult patient, her hands moved with a precision that didn't quite fit the casual medical environment around her. The movements came from muscle memory built in a very different theater. A different kind of operating table. She never hesitated. Never repositioned. Just thread, secure, saline lock, next patient. In her locker, hidden behind the spare compression stockings she never wore, was a folded American flag. She didn't know why she'd kept it. Protocol said she should have burned it or buried it or done something ceremonial. Instead, it lived in a plastic Ziploc bag at the bottom of her locker, and sometimes during breaks at 3 in the morning, she would pull it out and run her thumbs across the creases. The flag was from Sergeant Elena Diaz. They'd been together in Baghdad for 14 months across 2 deployments. Elena had been her closest asset, her partner in the field, the thought still caught sometimes. She'd kept the flag because it was all that made sense to keep. Laura Bennett was Captain Laura Bennett, though nobody here knew that. Nobody here knew about the silver star that sat in a box at her apartment in a converted warehouse on the river. Nobody here knew about the 3 tours between 2009 and 2014, or the way her hands could intubate a patient in under 40 seconds because she'd done emergency cricothyrotomies under fire. She was just the quiet nurse who never complained, who stayed late without being asked, who moved through the hospital like she was reading tactical blueprints in the floor plans. The cardiac unit at St. Michael's was a 15-bed ward on the 4th floor, painted a color that someone had decided was soothing, a pale blue that reminded Laura of the sky over Helmand Province, washed out and distant. The nurse's station sat at the center like a command post. Tonight, she had 4 patients, an 83-year-old post-MI in bed 4, a 60-year-old with atrial fibrillation in bed 6, a 45-year-old cardiac transplant candidate in bed 8, and a new admission in bed 2 who'd come up from recovery about an hour ago. The recovery room nurse had given her a brief handoff, nothing remarkable. Post-operative. Stable vital signs. Continuous cardiac monitoring. Standard post-surgical protocol. She was prepping the medication tray for her 6 a.m. rounds when she heard the footsteps, confident, loud, the kind of footsteps that announced importance before the person attached to them appeared. Dr. Marcus Pierce. He was the head of cardiology at St. Michael's, the kind of doctor who wore his credentials like medals on his chest. Johns Hopkins. Cleveland Clinic. 3 published papers in JAMA. His white coat was pristine, starched so aggressively it looked like it could stand up on its own, and his name embroidered across the pocket was in script so elegant it bordered on mockery. He arrived for morning rounds at 6:02 a.m., which meant he was early, which meant he was checking up on something. His eyes found her immediately at the nurse's station, scanning the medication tray she'd just finished. Morphine sulfate 2 mg 4, potassium chloride 20 MEq in saline, metoprolol 5 mg for push for the atrial fib patient. Everything labeled, everything documented, everything correct. His gaze lingered on her hands. Bennett, he said, and her name sounded like an insult in his mouth. You're still here. Laura didn't look up. Night shift ends at 7. Right. The night shift. He said it like it was beneath him, which it was. Night shifts meant less supervision, fewer administrators, no one to watch you work. How are our patients? She ran through the vitals efficiently. Heart rates. blood pressures, oxygen saturations, medication compliance. She spoke in the flat, professional tone she'd perfected, enough information to be competent, not enough personality to be memorable. When she finished, Dr. Pierce was watching her with something that looked like suspicion. "The new admission in bed 2, he said. "Post-op cardiac patient. I want you to increase monitoring." "Already continuous," she said. "Increase it anyway." She didn't argue. That was another thing she'd learned. Arguing made people pay attention. She simply nodded, and when he moved on to rounds, she moved to bed 2 to adjust the monitor leads, though they were already perfectly placed. The patient was a man in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, the kind of solid frame that spoke of discipline. He was sleeping deeply, probably still under the effects of residual anesthesia, his breathing regular through the nasal cannula delivering 2 liters of oxygen. The day shift nurses arrived at 7 a.m. Laura gave her hand off to Jennifer, the day shift charge nurse, keeping her tone crisp and factual. Jennifer was good, 23 years on the unit, 2 kids in college, the kind of nurse who actually listened instead of just waiting for her turn to talk. But even Jennifer seemed to keep distance from Laura. People did that. They sensed something off about her, some quality that didn't quite fit the hospital's carefully maintained culture of polite exhaustion. Laura clocked out at 7:15. She walked through the parking lot in the early heat, the August sun already promising another brutal day, and drove her 2011 Honda Civic to the apartment she'd rented month to month for 8 months. The flag stayed in her locker. She drove with both hands on the wheel, just under the speed limit, the radio off. In her apartment, she made coffee and sat on the small balcony overlooking the Savannah River. The water moved slowly, deliberately, the way things did in the South, nothing rushed, everything patient, everything containing secrets. She slept for 4 hours. Her dreams were always the same when she managed to dream at all: the sound of RPG fire, the smell of burning diesel, Elena's voice saying "contact right" over the radio before the transmission cut to static. At 3 p.m., she woke and lay in the dark with her eyes open, tracing the cracks in the ceiling plaster. At 5 p.m., she showered. At 6:15, she was back at St. Michael's, walking through the employee entrance, swiping her badge, climbing the stairs to the 4th floor. The evening shift was underway. The unit hummed with a different energy than the night shift, more bodies, more voices, more chaos contained in organized patterns. Laura moved to her locker and pulled on fresh scrubs, then made her way to the cardiac unit. Dr. Pierce was gone. The day nurses were transitioning to evening nurses. The 4 patients from her morning rounds were stable, vital solid, no obvious crisis pending. But the new admission in bed 2, the post-op cardiac patient, was awake now, his eyes tracking the room with the kind of careful attention that suggested military background. Not the slack awareness of someone doped on post-operative medications. Something sharper. She approached the bed to check the monitor leads and adjust the infusion rate. The patient watched her hands as she worked. His eyes were blue, the kind of sharp blue that reminded her of someone she'd known in Kandahar province, a Marine colonel who'd gone out on a mission she wasn't cleared to know about and never came back. She didn't make eye contact with the patient. Just worked. Monitor lead check. For site assessment, clean, no redness, no infiltration. Saline running clear. Everything perfect. "You were a combat medic," the patient said quietly. Laura's hand stilled for exactly 1/10 of a second. Not enough for someone not trained to notice. But his eyes caught it. She finished securing the 4-line and stepped back from the bed. "Just a nurse, sir," she said, and her voice had that deferential quality she'd cultivated, the slight deference that made her invisible. "Safe." 12 years I spent in the Navy, the patient said, his voice quiet but with the weight of certainty. "I know field medicine when I see it. That technique you just used for the 4, that's not textbook civilian. That's pressure point insertion. That's what they teach you when you've got maybe 30 seconds before the medevac arrives." She checked his monitor. Heart rate 72. Sinus rhythm, regular. O2 sat 98%. Everything textbook perfect. She was about to walk away when something made her pause, not a mistake, just a pause at the threshold between two choices. The patient was still watching her. "Whatever you were," he said, "thank you for what you did. And welcome to St. Michael's, Captain." The last word hung in the air like smoke. The room went dead silent. 20 residents froze mid-breath as Dr. Pierce pulled Laura's charting from the rack outside room for 12, holding it up like evidence in a trial he'd already won. His voice filled the hallway, sharp and clinical, designed to carry weight. "This is what happens when we prioritize warm bodies over proper education. Look at this documentation. Dangerously simplistic for complex cases. Bennett here thinks a cardiac patient needs nothing more than vitals and basic assessments." Laura stood 3 feet away, her hand steady as surgical steel, drawing up insulin from a vial with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Her jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped beneath her skin, but she never paused. Never looked up. Never gave him the satisfaction of her attention. Pierce continued, his voice rising slightly, hunting for a reaction that wouldn't come. "Though I suppose we can't expect more from someone who probably couldn't get into a real nursing program." One of the residents, a woman with nervous eyes, looked from Pierce to Laura and back again, waiting for something. An apology. A flinch. A crack in the facade. Nothing came. Laura capped the syringe and moved toward room for 12, her badge catching the fluorescent light and throwing it across the sterile white walls like a small beacon of indifference. Pierce had drawn first blood, and he'd drawn it publicly. 2 days later, he tried again. The break room at St. Michael's Hospital was a fluorescent tomb of beige cabinets and a vending machine that hummed like something dying slowly. Laura inserted a dollar bill at 3:02 p.m., the exact middle of her shift, when the unit was staffed and she had 13 minutes before the next medication rounds. Pierce materialized beside the machine with a resident in tow, a young intern named Marcus who looked barely old enough to shave. Pierce's voice carried the sticky-sweet tone of someone performing for an audience, even when the audience was just one frightened kid. "Bennett, which button gets you the chips? Do you need help reading the labels, or should I draw you a picture?" The intern laughed nervously, the laugh of someone who understood the hierarchy and didn't want to be on the wrong side of it. Laura selected her item, row D4, a bag of almonds, because she'd learned long ago that fuel was just fuel and emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. She took her snack and walked past both of them without acknowledgement, though her knuckles were white around her coffee cup, the ceramic warm against skin that had learned to hold steady under much worse than words. But the whispers had already started spreading through the unit like contamination. Fired from her last position for falsifying patient records. Credentials questionable. Barely passed her boards. A temporary nurse brought in to fill gaps, not someone with real training. Someone to tolerate, not respect. The rumors moved faster than the truth ever could, and Pierce had seeded them with the precision of someone who understood institutional power, how to weaponize it, how to turn a hospital's machinery against a single person and make it look like procedure. That afternoon, a new resident named Chen struggled with an for insertion on Mr. Kowalski in room for 08, a man recovering from a bleeding ulcer who needed reliable access. The resident had missed twice, and Kowalski's arm was swelling, bruising purple beneath the skin. Laura watched from the medication cart, her eyes tracking the angle of Chen's needle, the flex of his wrist. He was angling too shallow. The catheter would bounce off the vessel wall. She knew this the way soldiers know when an approach is tactically unsound, not from textbooks but from having done it correctly under conditions where failure meant someone didn't walk out of a room. She stepped forward. "Let me help." Her voice was quiet, deferential, the same voice she'd been trained to use for 8 months, the voice that asked permission instead of commanded it. She adjusted Chen's hand position, showed him the angle where the vein actually sat beneath the skin, demonstrated the insertion with movement so smooth they looked effortless. The catheter advanced. Blood flashed in the chamber. Good placement. She secured it with tape and stepped back, finished before anyone else had time to process what had happened. Pierce materialized in the doorway like something summoned. His face had gone the color of old brick, and his jaw worked before he spoke. Step away from that patient, Bennett. Now. You're practicing beyond your scope, and if I see you touching equipment without direct physician supervision again, I'll have security escort you out of this hospital in handcuffs. The words were designed to humiliate, calibrated for maximum effect, with the resident still standing there, with other staff hearing from their stations down the hall. Laura stepped back from Kowalski's bedside, hands at her sides, her face a perfect mask of professional neutrality. Of course, Dr. Pierce. My apologies. But inside her chest, something had shifted. The careful balance she'd maintained, the deferential posture, the quiet compliance, the 8 months of absorbing professional cruelty without response, had reached its limit. She felt it like pressure building in a closed system. That night, she sat alone in her apartment with a folded flag on the table in front of her. It was tan military issue, triangle folded, from Marcus Webb's 2007 unit, a teammate who'd stepped on an IED in the sunny triangle, someone she'd known for 48 hours before his death. She kept it in a drawer most days, unable to look at it, unable to throw it away. Tonight she'd taken it out. She stared at her reflection in the dark window, gaunt in the streetlight, marked by 8 years of work that no one would ever know about, wondering how much longer she could maintain this cover before something inside snapped. Then her hospital phone buzzed. Webb. He'd been transferred to her unit that morning, post-surgical, Navy Captain Marcus Webb, a man whose file she'd memorized months ago. 52 years old. Procurement officer. Maritime Supply Division. The asset. The reason she was here. She read the text, "You okay?" So what happened? She didn't respond. She couldn't. Not yet. On Tuesday at 6:15 a.m., Webb arrived at St. Michael's as a post-surgical cardiac patient, transferred from intensive care after a triple bypass that had taken 5 hours and left him with a long sternal incision that ran from his collarbone to his diaphragm like a map of violence. He was silver-haired, his face weathered in that specific way that came from command decisions and the weight of responsibility, the kind of bearing that didn't disappear just because you were lying in a hospital bed wearing a gown that tied in the back. Laura performed her initial assessment with the efficiency she'd developed over 8 months of invisibility, her vitals, surgical site inspection, medication reconciliation, chest tube patency. Her hands moved through the protocol while her mind calculated 17 different scenarios, each one worse than the last. Webb watched her with unusual intensity. When she checked his chest tube placement, palpating for subcutaneous emphysema with the systematic precision of someone looking for air in tissue spaces, her fingers moved in a pattern that wasn't standard civilian nursing protocol. It was field technique. It was Baghdad. It was 8 years ago when she'd been Captain Laura Bennett, 54th Combat Support Hospital, Ballard, and men died under her hands because they had to, because the alternative was everyone died, because sometimes you didn't have time for textbooks and mercy happened simultaneously. You were a combat medic, Webb whispered. His voice barely carried, but in the quiet of the early morning, with the hospital not yet fully awake, it landed like detonation. Laura's hands froze for exactly half a second, less time than a heartbeat, but in that fraction of time, the entire architecture of her cover shifted. She continued her assessment, her voice dropping. Controlled. I'm a nurse, Captain Webb. Let me know if you experience any chest pain or shortness of breath. But Webb smiled slightly, the smile of someone whose instincts had just been confirmed. Baghdad. That's where you learned that check. I was Army Medical Logistics, 2005 to 2007. I know field technique when I see it. The way you palpate for air, the pressure points. Nobody learns that in nursing school. Laura's face remained neutral as she updated his chart, but her heart hammered against her ribs like it wanted out. Webb was her primary asset, had been for 8 months, a Navy procurement officer feeding naval intelligence information about medical supply diversion from military hospitals to black market networks, stolen surgical kits and high-end diagnostic equipment routed through St. Michael's as a civilian laundering operation. Phantom requisitions, created by someone inside the hospital, someone with access and authorization. She'd been placed here by naval intelligence specifically to identify that inside contact, to confirm the supply chain, to build a case that would hold in federal court. And now her asset had just recognized her in a hospital hallway while Dr. Pierce moved through the unit like a territorial predator, and if anyone had heard, if Pierce suspected, her entire 8-month operation would collapse. That evening, Webb pressed his call button, and when Laura arrived at 8:42 p.m. with the unit mostly quiet, he gestured for her to come closer. His voice was barely a murmur. "How long have you been here?" She checked his full line, her fingers moving with mechanical precision, her voice so low only he could hear. 8 months. The diversion is happening through surgical supplies. Someone's creating phantom orders and routing them to a private warehouse on West 47th. At least 16 shipments so far. Webb nodded almost imperceptibly. "I've got 3 names. But I need 2 more weeks to confirm the external buyers. I'm supposed to be coordinating the next acquisition with my suppliers, and they're getting nervous." Laura finished flushing his fore and stepped back, her face a blank professional mask. "Rest. Your body needs to heal." She walked back to the medication cart, and in the distance, the cardiac monitor beeped its steady rhythm like a metronome counting down to something she couldn't yet see. Behind her, through the window, Savannah's night pressed against the glass, and somewhere in that darkness, the clock was running. 2 more weeks. Somehow, she had to survive Pierce for 2 more weeks and keep her cover intact. And then everything would change. What happened next didn't just challenge everything she'd built. It shattered it. 3 days. That's how long Captain Webb had been stable. 3 days of monitors beeping their mechanical rhythm, 3 days of his color improving, 3 days of Laura watching him from the hallway while Dr. Pierce made his rounds, always positioned between her and the patient like a border wall. The entire cardiac unit had settled back into its routine, the crisis had passed, the drama had faded, and Laura had returned to being what she always was, invisible. Just a nurse. Just someone pushing medication trays and charting vitals while the real doctors decided what mattered. She was reviewing charts at the nurse's station around 2:24 p.m. when it happened. The monitor alarm didn't beep. It screamed. A high-pitched wail that cut through every conversation in the unit, that primal sound that every nurse knows means cardiac compromise, and Laura's body moved before her brain caught up. Muscle memory. She was on her feet before the alarm completed its second cycle, her badge clattering against the tile floor, a sound like shell casings hitting concrete, and she was already moving toward room 412 before anyone else had processed which room. She knew. She'd always known where he was. Captain Webb was gasping. His neck veins distended like ropes beneath his skin, his trachea visibly shifted to the left, his chest heaving in that distinctive panicked rhythm of someone whose lung had collapsed and was now compressing his heart. His oxygen saturation climbed across the monitor screen in descending numbers, 88, 84, 79, 76. The numbers falling like a countdown. His lips had started to turn a shade of blue that didn't belong on any living person, and his eyes were rolling back into his head with the kind of desperation that comes from drowning while breathing air. Tension pneumothorax. One-sided lung collapse. 1,000 cubic centimeters of air pressing against his heart with every breath, crushing it, suffocating him from the inside out. He had 90 seconds. Maybe less. Laura was already moving toward the crash cart when she saw Dr. Pierce emerge from the adjacent room. He was 20 feet away, framed in the doorway like a portrait of surgical composure, hands clasped in front of him, eyes assessing the situation with the cold precision of a man who had seen 10,000 crises and survived them all through inaction and protocol. For 5 crucial seconds, he didn't move. He just stood there, evaluating. And in that pause, Laura understood something that made her blood run cold. Pierce knew exactly who Captain Webb was. He knew about the naval intelligence operation. He knew about the supply diversion investigation, the black market pipeline, the information Webb had been feeding her through careful conversations about medication inventory counts and procurement officer schedules. And if Webb died right now, in this room, the entire operation died with him. Pierce pulled out his phone. "I'm calling for a surgical consult," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Everyone stay back. This requires protocol." Webb's lips were turning grey now. His body was convulsing slightly, that involuntary spasm that comes when the brain isn't getting enough oxygen, when the primitive lizard brain starts screaming for air that won't come. Laura grabbed the alcohol swab and a 14-gauge needle from the crash cart, her hands moving with the kind of fluid precision that comes from muscle memory that lives deeper than thought. Baghdad. The market in Sadr City. A Marine with shrapnel in his lung cavity and no surgical suite for 50 kilometers. She positioned the needle at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact anatomical landmark, the only place where gravity and physics would let air escape from the pleural space. Dr. Pierce's face transformed. The composure cracked. The authority shattered. He lunged forward, his body suddenly electric with rage, and his voice hit a register that made 3 nurses flinch. Bennett, you are not authorized for that procedure. Step away from the patient immediately or I will have you arrested for assault. Laura inserted the needle. The hiss was immediate. Violent. A rush of air escaping that sounded like a tire deflating in reverse, like pressure finally finding its release, and Captain Webb's entire body went rigid for a single moment before his oxygen saturation began climbing. 76, 81. 88. His gasping stopped. His eyes cleared. Color flooded back into his face like someone was turning up a dimmer switch on his life force, and he took a single deep breath that seemed to pull him back from the edge of whatever cliff he'd been standing on. The cardiac unit had crowded into the doorway. 12 staff members. 12 witnesses who watched Laura perform a procedure that wasn't in her scope, that violated every protocol about what a nurse could do without a physician's direct order, that absolutely shouldn't have worked, and yet had saved a man's life in the time it took to breathe once. Dr. Pierce's face wasn't purple anymore. It had gone past that into something pale and trembling, his jaw working like he was chewing words he couldn't quite spit out. When he finally spoke, his voice came out thin and clipped. You just assaulted a patient with an unauthorized invasive procedure. You're done. Don't touch anything else. Security is on their way. And so is HR. He pulled out his phone again, but this time the call wasn't for a surgical consult. Within 20 minutes, Laura was walking through the corridors of St. Michael's with a security escort, not rough, not humiliating, just professional and utterly final. The escort was a man named Torres, who'd brought her coffee twice in the last 8 months and never made eye contact the way some of the other security people did. He didn't speak. Just walked beside her to the 4th-floor HR office where a woman named Catherine with kind eyes and a voice that sounded genuinely sorry told her that Dr. Pierce had already been in contact with 3 board members, that an outside investigator had been called in to examine her credentials, that there were preliminary reports of credential irregularities that would need to be resolved before she could return to patient care. "Are you firing me?" Laura asked, her voice perfectly level. Catherine looked at her hands. "We're placing you on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. Dr. Pierce has documented concerns about your qualifications. Given the severity of today's incident, the board has decided. I saved his life. I understand that. I do. But Dr. Pierce is a tenured physician with 30 years of hospital history. The board values his judgment." Catherine's hands twisted together like she was wringing out a dishcloth. "I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry. But there are procedures we have to follow." By 4:15 p.m., Laura was escorted out of St. Michael's through the employee entrance. The afternoon sun was bright enough to hurt, and the parking lot smelled like diesel exhaust and hot asphalt. She sat in her car for exactly 8 minutes, not driving, not crying, just breathing through her nose like she was running a race where only she could see the finish line. She pulled out her phone and saw 14 missed messages from a restricted number. 14 attempts to contact her from a phone that belonged to someone important enough to keep their number classified. The Navy intelligence liaison. The person who designed this entire operation 8 months ago. She didn't call back yet. Instead, she drove to a diner called Maggie's on Victory Drive, the kind of place where nobody knew your name and nobody cared. She ordered coffee at 3 a.m., except it was still light outside, the sun hadn't even set yet, so maybe it was just her brain doing that thing where time loses its meaning when everything changes. The coffee went cold in her hands. She stared at her reflection in the diner window and didn't recognize the person looking back. 8 years of covert service. 8 years of walking into harm's way for people who would never know her name. 8 years of holding her identity so tight it had become invisible. And in one moment, one decision to save a life instead of protect to cover, she'd blown the entire operation wide open. The phone rang at 3:17 a.m. Except it wasn't 3:17 a.m. It was still afternoon. The sun was still high. Laura's brain was just broken in a way that made time feel like water. She answered the restricted number before it could ring a second time. Nightingale 6. The voice on the other end was older, military precise. You just saved your asset. And you just ended your career. Dr. Pierce activated his network the moment your needle went in. He's been calling every ally he has for the last 4 hours. I know, Laura said quietly. Your cover is compromised. Your credentials are under investigation. By tomorrow morning, you won't be employable as a nurse in Georgia. By the end of the week, you won't be employable anywhere. I know, she said again. What do you need? Laura watched her reflection in the diner window, the same face she'd been wearing for 8 months, the deferential nurse, the invisible woman, the nobody who'd somehow become dangerous enough to require emergency recall. I need to know if Captain Webb is still alive. Stable. In ICU under Pierce's watch, which means isolated from you. Your asset is secured, but you're burned. Mission is compromised. We're calling you home. The line went quiet except for the hum of encrypted communication. Laura, the voice said, and it was the first time anyone had used her actual name since she'd arrived at St. Michael's 8 months ago. Did you make the right call? She didn't answer. She just sat in the diner with her cold coffee and her broken sense of time, staring at a reflection that was finally starting to crack, and wondered if saving a life meant losing the only identity she had left. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer as Margaret Chen from HR gestured toward the chair across from her desk. The folder between them was thick enough to contain a life, or destroy one. Ms. Bennett, Dr. Pierce has raised serious concerns about your credentials, Chen said, her voice carrying the careful sympathy of someone delivering bad news she didn't fully understand. He's contacted what he believes are your nursing school references. There are discrepancies in your employment history. Laura sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of professional concern, but her mind was calculating trajectories. Pierce had activated his network. Board members. External investigators. The institutional machinery grinding forward with the inexorable weight of bureaucracy designed to bury people like her, people who didn't fit the boxes. Additionally, you performed an invasive medical procedure without physician authorization, Chen continued, opening the file. Dr. Pierce is recommending immediate termination and possible criminal charges for practicing medicine without a license. She pushed photographs across the desk, documentation of Captain Webb's emergency, statements from residents, medical board guidelines highlighted in yellow. The needle decompression, the way you performed it, it's outside the scope of nursing practice in Georgia. Laura looked at the photos without touching them. She could see her own hands in the images, steady as surgical steel, performing the procedure exactly as she'd been trained 8 years ago at the Naval Medical Training Facility in Bethesda. The second intercostal space. The midclavicular line. The hiss of air escaping from a collapsed lung. Muscle memory doesn't lie. It doesn't wear uniforms or carry credentials. It just does. Captain Webb was dying of tension pneumothorax, Laura said quietly, her voice pitched low and even. The needle decompression saved his life. Chen's expression was genuinely sympathetic but immovable, like a nurse refusing pain medication because the order hadn't been updated. Dr. Pierce has statements from 3 board members supporting his assessment that you acted recklessly. I'm sorry, but effective immediately, your employment at St. Michael's is terminated. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. The words landed like bullets into water, they made ripples but didn't penetrate, not immediately. Laura nodded once, a small precise movement, and stood. 8 years of covert service compressed into a termination meeting in a room that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and photocopier toner. She'd walked into hostile territory with nothing but a field guide and a prayer. She'd extracted wounded soldiers from burning buildings while people shot at her. And she'd been defeated by a spreadsheet and a man who wore his credentials like armor. Security walked her to her locker at 11:53 a.m. The fold-up space contained almost nothing of her real self, a single photograph of Derek at his middle school graduation, a pair of trauma shears with her initials engraved on the handle, a folded flag from her fallen teammate Marcus that she'd kept for 8 years, pressed against the back wall where no one could see it. She stuffed everything into a paper bag. The guard watched with the kind of polite disinterest that meant he'd done this before and would do it again. By 3 in the morning, Laura sat alone in a diner called the Lighthouse, which was ironic because there was nothing lighthouse-like about it, just flickering neon, cracked vinyl, and the smell of stale coffee underneath something sweeter, like old syrup or regret. The waitress had long since stopped asking if she needed anything. Laura's coffee had gone cold an hour ago, the surface developing a thin film like a cataract's forming across an eye. She stared at her reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back at her was gaunt, hollowed out, her uniform replaced by civilian clothes that felt like a costume worn one scene too long. Her phone had 2 messages from her naval intelligence handler, a woman named Commander Torres who operated out of an office in Norfolk that probably didn't exist on any map. The messages said, "Status update required and rendezvous window closing in 18 hours." Laura couldn't answer because the truth was worse than silence. 8 years embedded in various medical facilities across the Southeast, monitoring supply chains, tracking diversions, building a case against Captain Webb's procurement network, and it had just evaporated because she'd chosen to save a life over protecting the mission. The protocol was simple: observe, document, don't interfere. Let the network operate until you've mapped all the nodes. Then coordinate with federal prosecutors and DEA. Instead, she performed an emergency medical procedure in front of 70 witnesses, blown her cover into the hospital security cameras, and made herself useless. The supply diversion network was still operating. Captain Webb was still alive, which was good. She didn't regret saving him, but the intelligence value was gone. The mission was gone. Her son Derek had texted at 2 a.m. "Mom, where are you? Dad says you got fired? Call me." The message sat in her phone like an accusation. Derek still believed she was a nurse. A woman who worked long hours in a hospital because she cared about people. He didn't know about Baghdad or the convoy ambush or the 14 Marines she'd kept alive for 6 hours while bullets punched through the medical tent canvas like angry wasps. He didn't know about the folded flag or the Navy Cross or the fact that his mother's entire identity was compartmentalized into drawers and boxes, each one locked with a key that only she held. She lifted the coffee cup. The liquid inside had achieved that particular temperature where it was neither hot nor cold but something worse, lukewarm, the temperature of resignation. The mug said "Savannah loves you" in cheerful script, which struck her as the saddest thing she'd ever read. The diner's door chimed at 3:02 a.m. Laura didn't look up. The footsteps belonged to a delivery driver, judging by the rhythm. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical prayer, and somewhere in the kitchen, someone was frying something that would probably taste better than it had any right to taste. The universe didn't care about failed missions. It just kept turning, kept grinding forward, kept asking people to show up and do the next thing. Her reflection in the window showed a woman whose hands had held 14 lives together with nothing but skill and stubbornness. Those same hands were folded around a cold cup of coffee, and they were shaking. No. That was wrong. The trembling wasn't fear, that wasn't her. The trembling was restraint. 8 years of controlled response, of measured breathing, of accepting humiliation without flinching because the mission required it. 8 years of restraint finally breaking against the simple fact that restraint doesn't save you. Courage doesn't save you. Skill doesn't save you. Only identity saves you. And hers had just been incinerated by a folder full of documentation and a man who'd never fired a weapon or held someone's bleeding hand and promised them they'd make it home. Laura looked at the folded flag in her paper bag. She looked at the trauma shears with her initials engraved. She looked at her gaunt reflection in the dark window and understood something fundamental had shifted. The woman in the diner could disappear. The nurse could vanish. But the captain, the one who'd survived Baghdad, who'd walked out of fires that should have consumed her, who'd just saved a man's life while 70 people watched and did nothing, that woman was about to become visible in ways that would change everything. The morning was coming. In a few hours, Derek would show up somewhere he didn't belong, carrying something precious that she'd forced him to promise never to tell anyone about. Captain Webb would find his voice. And the cascade would begin, inevitable as gravity, as unstoppable as a convoy running into an ambush. But for now, in the 3 a.m. stillness, there was only cold coffee and a reflection that was finally starting to crack. The conference room at St. Michael's was packed, administrators in the back, department heads in folding chairs, staff clustered near the door, when the 2 FBI agents entered without knocking. They wore identical dark suits that hung like promises of consequences, and their badges caught the fluorescent light as they moved through the crowd with the unhurried precision of people who'd done this before. Special Agent Torres was built like a diesel engine that had learned to speak, and she pointed directly at Dr. Pierce without ceremony. "Dr. Richard Pierce, we need you to come with us regarding an ongoing investigation into insurance fraud and evidence tampering." Pierce's face went from red to a shade of purple that made the cardiologists in the room exchange glances. He backed away, hands raised. "This is absurd. I'm the chief of cardiology. I have nothing to do with." Agent Torres stepped closer, and her partner blocked the exit. "We've been monitoring your private billing practices for 6 months. Yesterday you attempted to forge documentation proving Captain Bennett's credentials were fraudulent, and you contacted federal databases using false pretenses." She held up a tablet showing security footage, grainy, timestamp marked, of Pierce physically reaching for Laura's arm during Captain Webb's crisis, attempting to pull her away from the needle decompression. "You also deliberately delayed emergency treatment of a federal witness, Captain Webb, in what appears to be obstruction of justice." The room erupted. Whispers turned into conversations. A resident dropped a stack of charts and nobody picked them up. Pierce pointed a shaking finger at Laura, who stood motionless in the center of the room, her hands at her sides, her breathing steady. "She's the one who's been lying. She's been working here under false pretenses. She assaulted a patient." His voice cracked on the last word like a boy's voice, and the authority that had terrified the nursing staff for 18 months shattered into pieces. Agent Torres held up the tablet again, and this time she scrolled through documents with a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever. "This shows 3 board members under investigation for accepting kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies. All 3 received calls from you requesting they conduct credential investigations into Captain Bennett. All 3 have agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors." She looked at Pierce with the flat expression of someone watching an insect under glass. "The outside investigator you hired flagged your requests as suspicious and reported them to us voluntarily. You created a paper trail of fraud so detailed we could teach a seminar on how not to cover your tracks." Captain Webb spoke from his wheelchair, oxygen hissing softly through the nasal cannula taped to his face, and when he spoke his voice had the weight of someone used to giving orders. "Dr. Pierce has been the hospital's inside contact for medical supply diversion. He's been creating phantom surgical orders and routing military-grade supplies to black market buyers. The operation involves 7 states, $40 million, and at least 14 pharmaceutical companies." He paused, letting that number sit in the room like a body. "Captain Bennett was placed here to identify him." She did. The pieces fell into place visibly. You could see them connecting on people's faces, could watch the nurses who'd believed Pierce's rumors about Laura 8 months ago finally understand that they'd been lied to. The vending machine comment. The grand rounds mockery. The threat to call security. All of it was misdirection, the desperate flailing of a man trying to discredit a witness before she could testify. Pierce backed against the wall, and his hands were trembling now, visibly trembling, the kind of trembling that comes not from fear but from the sensation of everything you've built collapsing at once. "I want my lawyer. I'm not saying anything without." The FBI agents moved with that same unhurried precision, and the handcuffs clicked around Pierce's wrists with a sound like period marks at the end of a sentence. They read him his rights in voices that had done this thousands of times, and when they turned him toward the door, his eyes found Laura's across the room. For one moment, just one, she met his gaze with the flat, empty stare of someone who'd learned in Baghdad that rage only works if your opponent shows fear. She didn't show fear. She showed nothing at all. The perp walk through St. Michael's main corridor was witnessed by over 100 employees. Nurses stepped back to let them pass. A patient's family recorded it on their phone. Residents watched in silence as the man who'd controlled the hospital's social hierarchy for 18 months shuffled forward in handcuffs, his face purple with something that looked like rage but was actually humiliation finally finding its target. The cameras flashed from phones in pockets. The corridor echoed with the sound of his footsteps and the soft clink of metal against fabric. By the time they reached the main exit, the story was already spreading through text messages and hospital group chats. The chief of cardiology was being arrested. The rumors about Laura had been lies. Everything was reversed. 6 months later, October light streamed through the windows of St. Michael's new Veteran Services wing, and the opening ceremony felt less like an event and more like a reclamation of something lost. Laura stood in dress navy blues with her medals arranged on her chest in ascending order of prestige, Bronze Star first, then Silver Star, then the Navy Cross that Derek had brought in the shadow box and placed in her hands with tears streaming down his face, and she wore them like armor, visible and undeniable. Captain Webb stood beside her in his own dress uniform, the shoulder boards catching the light, fully recovered now, his lungs expanding with it that moved freely through passages the needle decompression had opened 6 months ago. The hospital administrator spoke about service and sacrifice, about honoring those who'd given everything to defend the country, and he pointedly did not mention Dr. Pierce. Nobody mentioned Dr. Pierce. The entire room had collectively agreed to stop speaking his name aloud, as if saying it would give him substance he no longer deserved. Through the window, Laura could see the community college across the street. On the 3rd floor, in a classroom with beige walls and fluorescent overhead lights, Dr. Pierce was teaching CPR basics to students who didn't want to be there, nurses taking required continuing education, healthcare workers fulfilling mandates, nobody paying attention to the man at the front with the revoked medical license and the teaching contract that paid slightly above minimum wage. His permanent suspension from medicine had come down 3 weeks after his arrest, and the state board's decision had been unanimous. The press release cited incompetence, deliberate interference with patient care, and attempted obstruction of federal justice. Nobody had defended him. Nobody had called in favors. The network he'd spent 18 months building had evaporated the moment people realized they could be implicated in the same crimes. The ribbon-cutting ceremony proceeded with the precision of military protocol. A flag was raised. A junior Marine veteran in dress blues played taps on a trumpet that sounded like grief and honor compressed into one instrument. The nurses who'd once avoided Laura based on Pierce's rumors now staffed the Veteran Services Clinic, and several had apologized with tears on their faces, understanding finally that they'd been manipulated, that the things they'd believed about her had been calculated lies designed to isolate her and discredit her when the moment came. A young Marine in a wheelchair rolled up to Laura after the ceremony ended, and his question had the directness of someone used to getting straight answers. "Were you really Nightingale 6?" Laura smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face, no longer stoic, no longer hiding the precision and weight of her past, no longer wearing the mask of a civilian nurse drowning in humiliation. "I was. And now I'm here to make sure you get the care you earned." She knelt down slightly so she was level with his eyes, and her voice dropped into the register that military personnel recognized, the cadence of someone used to commanding respect without asking for it. "Anything you need, Marine. Anything." Captain Webb leaned close as the crowd dispersed, his voice carrying the warmth of someone you'd survived something with, someone you'd bled beside in the dark. "Think you'll miss the undercover work." Laura watched the flag lifting in the October wind, watched it snap straight and still, watched the colors catch the sunlight like a promise kept. She thought about 8 months of humiliation and silence, about Pierce's voice in grand rounds calling her charting simplistic, about the vending machine comment, about the moment when she'd known her cover was blown and 8 years of work had evaporated. She thought about the folded flag from her teammate that she'd carried like a prayer, and she shook her head slowly. "I spent 8 years hiding who I was. I'm done with covers." The ceremony wound down. The administrator shook hands. The junior Marine played one more note on the trumpet. And in the golden light of late afternoon, with the whole city visible through the windows of the new wing, Laura Bennett stood in uniform for the first time in 8 years and allowed herself to exhale fully. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in power, if you've ever had to prove your worth in silence, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about the ones who carry their strength quietly. What would you have done in Laura's position? Tell me in the comments below.